Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the powdered wigs and guillotines of a revolution that somehow convinced itself it could redesign entire civilization using nothing but philosophical pamphlets and righteous indignation. We're talking about the complete history of the French Revolution, and trust me, it's way more accidentally catastrophic than any textbook ever made it sound. Forget neat revolutionary phases, and imagine instead a decade where tax collectors accidentally triggered continental war, where tennis court oaths toppled thousand-year monarchies, and where bread riots somehow became the foundation of modern democracy. So smash that like button if you're ready for some seriously questionable nation building. Hit subscribe for more stories about how Enlightenment optimism accidentally invented political terror, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now settle in, because we're exploring how a country that started with nobles refusing to pay taxes somehow ended up with public executions as entertainment, constitutions nobody followed, and an entire government run by people who thought human nature could be improved through better paperwork and more patriotic festivals. In the year 1789, France was essentially a giant elaborate cake that was about to collapse under its own weight, except instead of frosting, it was covered in debt, and instead of candles, it had angry peasants with pitchforks. King Louis XVI sat on his throne, probably wondering why being an absolute monarch seemed so much easier in the job description. The country was drowning in financial crisis, having spent enormous sums supporting the American Revolution against Britain, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but turned out to be rather expensive. The royal treasury was emptier than a philosopher's promise of easy answers, and the king's finance ministers kept resigning faster than people leave a boring dinner party. The French society of the late 18th century was divided into 3 estates, a system so rigid it made a Victorian corset look flexible. The first estate consisted of the clergy, who owned about 10% of the land and paid virtually no taxes, spending their days in comfortable contemplation of divine matters, while the rest of the country struggled with decidedly earthly problems. The second estate was the nobility, who also paid minimal taxes and owned roughly 25% of the land, occupying themselves with elaborate court ceremonies and the serious business of looking important in powdered wigs. Then there was the third estate, which included everyone else, from wealthy merchants to urban workers to rural peasants, representing about 98% of the population, but bearing the heaviest tax burden. It was rather like organizing a dinner party, where 2 guests eat most of the food while the other 98 split the bill. The economic situation was deteriorating with the steady persistence of a leaky roof during a rainstorm. Poor harvests in the 1780s had driven up bread prices, and since bread constituted the primary food source for most French people, this was somewhat problematic. Urban workers were spending up to 80% of their income on bread alone, leaving little for luxuries like rent or clothing. Meanwhile, the government's debt had reached astronomical proportions, roughly equivalent to the entire annual revenue of the kingdom. Various finance ministers had attempted reforms, but these invariably involved asking the privileged estates to pay taxes, a suggestion that went over about, as well as proposing to serve vegetables at a children's birthday party. Jacques Necker, the Swiss banker who served as finance minister, published his famous Compte Rendu in 1781, which revealed the dire state of royal finances to the public for the first time. This was rather like a doctor publishing your medical records in the newspaper, informative, but not particularly comfortable for the patient. The document became a bestseller, which tells you something about the reading habits of 18th century France, where government financial reports could achieve literary fame. Necker's revelations about court spending and the extent of the debt crisis helped fuel growing public resentment against the monarchy's fiscal irresponsibility. The intellectual climate of the period was equally turbulent, with Enlightenment ideas spreading through French society like butter on warm bread. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu had spent decades questioning traditional authority, promoting concepts of natural rights, separation of powers, and popular sovereignty. Their ideas circulated through salons, coffee houses, and an expanding network of printed materials, creating what historians call the public sphere. Essentially, spaces where people could discuss politics without immediately being arrested. The American Revolution had provided a practical example of Enlightenment principles in action, demonstrating that it was actually possible to overthrow an established government and create something new, though the French would soon discover that revolution was considerably more complicated than it appeared from across the Atlantic. By 1787, the financial crisis had reached such proportions that even the most creative accounting could no longer disguise the problem. Finance Minister Charles Alexander de Calonne proposed a comprehensive reform package that would have imposed a universal land tax, affecting the privileged estates for the first time. The proposal was about as popular with the nobility and clergy as a vegetarian option at a barbecue competition. When Calonne presented his reforms to an assembly of notables, essentially a gathering of important people who were supposed to rubber stamp royal policies, they rejected the proposals and demanded that the king convene the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not met since 1614. The decision to call the Estates General was rather like opening Pandora's box, except instead of releasing abstract evils into the world, it released several million French people with opinions about government. The traditional format of the Estates General involved each estate meeting separately and casting one vote per estate, which meant that the first and second estates could always outvote the third estate 2-1, regardless of the actual number of people represented. This system had worked adequately when the primary function of the Estates General was to approve royal requests for money. But by 1789, the Third Estate had developed more ambitious ideas about political participation. The election process for the Estates General in early 1789 was surprisingly democratic for an absolute monarchy. Each estate elected representatives, and communities throughout France were invited to compile cahiers de doléances, lists of grievances and suggestions for reform. These cahiers provide a fascinating window into the concerns of ordinary French people, ranging from complaints about specific taxes to broader demands for constitutional government. The process of compiling these grievances and electing representatives served as a kind of political education for millions of French people who had never before participated in formal political processes. When the Estates General convened at Versailles on May 5, 1789, the ceremony was magnificent, and the underlying tensions were immediately apparent. The Third Estate representatives, dressed in simple black clothing, stood in stark contrast to the elaborate costumes of the nobility and clergy. The king's opening speech was disappointingly vague, focusing on the financial crisis while avoiding any mention of broader reforms. The Third Estate had arrived expecting to discuss fundamental changes to French government and society. Instead, they found themselves listening to what amounted to a request for new taxes delivered with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. The procedural disputes that followed were as riveting as watching paint dry, but they were also historically crucial. The Third Estate insisted that all three estates should meet together and vote by head rather than by estate, which would give them effective control since they had as many representatives as the other two estates combined. The nobility and clergy preferred the traditional system, which guaranteed their continued dominance. For several weeks, the three estates remained deadlocked, with the Third Estate refusing to verify their credentials or begin any substantive work until the procedural question was resolved. On June 17, 1789, the Third Estate took the revolutionary step of declaring themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the entire French nation rather than just one estate. This was rather like the junior employees at a company declaring themselves the board of directors. Technically possible, but likely to cause some organizational difficulties. The declaration was based on the principle that sovereignty resided in the nation as a whole, not in the king or in the traditional estates. It was a direct challenge to the fundamental basis of royal authority and the existing social order, 3 days later, on June 20th, the members of the National Assembly found themselves locked out of their usual meeting hall, ostensibly for preparations for a royal session. Suspecting that the king intended to dissolve their assembly, they gathered instead in a nearby tennis court and swore the famous tennis court oath, pledging not to separate until France had a new constitution. The oath was administered in a tennis court because that was the largest available indoor space, which gives the founding moment of French democracy a slightly absurd quality that seems entirely appropriate for the French Revolution. The tennis court oath represented a point of no return in the relationship between the monarchy and the emerging revolutionary movement. By swearing to create a constitution, the National Assembly was asserting that France needed fundamental laws that would limit royal power and establish the rights of citizens. This was a direct repudiation of absolute monarchy, though it was still unclear exactly what would replace it. The oath was signed by all but one of the Third Estate representatives present, creating a powerful symbol of unity and determination that would inspire revolutionary movements for generations. King Louis XVI's response to these developments was characterized by the kind of decisive leadership one might expect from someone who had inherited an impossible situation and possessed all the political instincts of a confused sheep. On June 23rd, he held a royal session where he offered some modest reforms, while firmly rejecting the National Assembly's claim to represent the nation. He ordered the estates to return to their separate meetings, then left the hall. The Third Estate representatives remained seated, and when the royal master of ceremonies repeated the king's order, Mirabeau, one of the most eloquent speakers in the assembly, reportedly declared that they would not move except at the point of bayonets. It was a moment of high drama that established the National Assembly's determination to resist royal authority. The political crisis was soon overshadowed by economic and social unrest throughout France. The harvest of 1788 had been particularly poor, and bread prices in Paris had reached levels that made basic survival difficult for working-class families. Unemployment was rising, and rumors circulated constantly about aristocratic plots to starve the people into submission. The combination of political uncertainty and economic hardship created a volatile atmosphere in which almost any incident could trigger widespread violence. On July 11, 1789, King Louis XVI dismissed Jacques Necker, the popular finance minister who had become a symbol of reform and fiscal responsibility. News of Necker's dismissal spread through Paris like wildfire, and crowds began gathering in the Palais Royal, where speakers denounced the king's action as evidence of a plot against the people. The political clubs and coffeehouses that had proliferated in recent months became centers of agitation, and by the evening of July 11th, crowds were roaming the streets of Paris, attacking customs barriers and searching for weapons. The search for weapons led the Parisian crowds to the Invalides, a military hospital and arsenal, where they seized thousands of muskets and cannons on the morning of July 14th. However, they still needed gunpowder and ammunition, which were stored in the Bastille, a medieval fortress that served as a royal prison and symbol of arbitrary royal authority. The Bastille was not particularly important as a prison. It held only 7 inmates at the time, but it had enormous symbolic significance as a representation of royal oppression. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, began as a negotiation and ended as a battle. A crowd of several hundred Parisians, including artisans, shopkeepers, and workers, gathered outside the fortress, demanding the surrender of the gunpowder stored inside. The governor of the Bastille, Bernard René de Launay, initially agreed to negotiate, but the situation deteriorated rapidly when the crowd became convinced that the garrison was preparing to fire on them. The actual assault on the fortress was relatively brief but bloody, resulting in the deaths of about 100 attackers and several defenders. The fall of the Bastille had consequences far beyond the immediate acquisition of gunpowder. The fortress was quickly demolished by enthusiastic crowds, and its stones were distributed throughout France, as symbols of the overthrow of tyranny. July 14th became the symbolic beginning of the French Revolution, though historians generally agree that the revolution had actually begun weeks earlier with the formation of the National Assembly. The storming of the Bastille demonstrated that the people of Paris were willing to use violence to defend their political gains, and it established a pattern of popular intervention in revolutionary politics that would continue throughout the revolutionary period. News of the fall of the Bastille spread throughout France with remarkable speed, triggering what historians call the Great Fear, a wave of panic and violence that swept through rural areas in late July and early August 1789. Peasants, convinced that aristocrats were organizing brigands to destroy their crops and restore the old order by force, attacked manor houses and burned feudal documents that recorded their obligations to their lords. The Great Fear was based largely on rumors and misunderstandings, but it reflected the deep social tensions that had been building in the French countryside for decades. The National Assembly's response to the Great Fear was the dramatic session of August 4th, 1789, when noble and clerical deputies competed with each other to renounce their feudal privileges. The session began with the Duke of Aiguillon proposing the abolition of feudalism, and continued through the night as deputy after deputy rose to surrender various rights and privileges. By dawn, the Assembly had abolished serfdom, feudal dues, the sale of offices, regional privileges, and numerous other features of the old regime. It was rather like watching people at an auction, bidding against themselves, except instead of acquiring things, they were giving them away. The abolition of feudalism was more symbolic than practical, since the Assembly's decree required peasants to compensate their former lords for the loss of certain rights. However, the August 4th decree established the principle that all French citizens would be equal before the law, eliminating the legal distinctions that had divided French society into separate estates. The decree also abolished the tithe paid to the Catholic Church and eliminated the tax exemptions enjoyed by the nobility and clergy, fundamentally restructuring the fiscal system that had contributed to the monarchy's financial crisis. On August 26, 1789, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that articulated the philosophical principles underlying the revolutionary transformation of France. The Declaration proclaimed that men are born and remain free and equal in rights, established the principle of popular sovereignty, and guaranteed basic civil liberties, including freedom of speech, religion, and the press. The document was heavily influenced by Enlightenment philosophy and the American Declaration of Independence, but it was specifically designed to address French conditions and concerns. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was revolutionary in its assertion that rights belong to individuals by virtue of their humanity rather than their social status or relationship to the monarch. This was a direct challenge to the hierarchical society of the old regime, where rights and privileges were distributed unequally based on birth and social position. The Declaration also established the principle that government derived its authority from the consent of the governed, effectively rejecting the divine right of kings that had provided the theoretical foundation for absolute monarchy. While the National Assembly was busy redesigning French society, King Louis XVI was demonstrating his commitment to the new order by refusing to approve either the August 4th decree or the Declaration of Rights. The king's resistance created a constitutional crisis, since the Assembly claimed to represent the sovereign will of the nation, while the king maintained his traditional right to approve or reject legislation. The deadlock was complicated by the king's decision to summon additional troops to the Paris region, which many interpreted as preparation for a military coup against the Assembly. The October days of 1789 resolved the immediate crisis through another dramatic intervention by the people of Paris. On October 5th, a crowd of several thousand Parisian women, angry about bread shortages and the king's refusal to approve the Assembly's decrees, marched to Versailles to confront the royal family directly. The march began at the Paris City Hall and grew as it proceeded, eventually including men as well as women, and acquiring several cannons along the way. The crowd's demands were straightforward. They wanted bread, and they wanted the king to approve the National Assembly's legislation. The confrontation at Versailles lasted 2 days and included some of the most dramatic moments of the early revolution. The crowd invaded the palace, nearly reaching the queen's apartments before being stopped by the royal guards. Marie Antoinette, who had become a particular target of popular hatred, was forced to appear on a balcony with the king to acknowledge the crowd's demands. The royal family agreed to return to Paris, effectively becoming prisoners of the revolutionary government, though this was not immediately apparent to contemporary observers. The forced return of the royal family to Paris in October 1789 marked the end of Versailles as the center of French political life and the beginning of the revolution's radical phase. The king and queen took up residence in the Tuileries Palace, where they were surrounded by revolutionary crowds and subjected to constant surveillance. The National Assembly also moved to Paris, establishing itself in a riding school near the Tuileries. The physical proximity of the assembly to the Parisian crowds would prove crucial in subsequent developments, as popular pressure repeatedly pushed the revolution in more radical directions. The National Assembly spent the next 2 years creating a new constitution for France, a process that involved resolving fundamental questions about the nature of government, the rights of citizens, and the relationship between church and state. The Constitution of 1791 established France as a constitutional monarchy with a unicameral legislature elected by active citizens, men who paid taxes equivalent to 3 days' wages. This excluded roughly half of adult males from political participation, creating a distinction between active and passive citizens that would become a source of ongoing controversy. The constitutional monarchy created by the 1791 Constitution was an attempt to balance revolutionary principles with practical governance needs. The king retained executive power and a suspensive veto over legislation, but his authority was clearly subordinated to the national will, as expressed through the legislature. The Constitution also established an independent judiciary and guaranteed the civil rights proclaimed in the Declaration of Rights. However, the system depended on cooperation between the king and the assembly, and Louis XVI's obvious reluctance to accept his reduced role created persistent tensions. One of the most controversial aspects of the revolutionary settlement was the civil constitution of the clergy, adopted in July 1790. This law restructured the Catholic Church in France, making priests and bishops elected officials paid by the state rather than appointed by the Pope and supported by church revenues. The civil constitution required all clergy to swear an oath of loyalty to the nation and the Constitution, effectively making them civil servants. About half of French priests refused to take the oath, creating a schism within the church that would have profound political consequences. The religious controversy created by the civil constitution of the clergy divided French society along new lines and provided opponents of the revolution with a powerful rallying point. Non-juring priests, those who refused the constitutional oath, became centers of counter-revolutionary activity, particularly in regions where traditional Catholic piety remained strong. The revolutionary government's attempts to enforce the civil constitution often met with violent resistance, especially in Western France, where religious opposition to the revolution would eventually develop into full-scale civil war. The economic policies of the revolutionary government were driven by the persistent financial crisis that had triggered the revolution in the first place. The National Assembly's solution was to nationalize church lands and issue paper money called assignats backed by the value of these properties. The assignats were initially successful in providing the government with desperately needed revenue, but the temptation to print more money than the confiscated lands could support eventually led to inflation and economic instability. The policy was rather like trying to solve a debt problem by writing more checks, which works until people realize the checks might bounce. The sale of church lands, known as biens nationaux, had profound social and economic consequences throughout France. The lands were sold at auction, theoretically making them available to anyone with sufficient capital. But in practice, they were mostly purchased by wealthy bourgeois investors and prosperous peasants. This created a new class of property owners with a vested interest in defending the revolution, since any restoration of the old regime would presumably involve returning the lands to the church. The land sales also accelerated the development of capitalist agriculture in France, as the new owners were generally more interested in profit than in maintaining traditional relationships with rural communities. King Louis XVI's attitude toward the revolutionary changes remained ambiguous throughout 1790 and early 1791. Publicly, he appeared to accept the new constitutional order, participating in revolutionary festivals and ceremonies with apparent enthusiasm. However, his private correspondence revealed deep reservations about the direction of events, and he maintained secret communications with foreign courts and émigré nobles who had fled France. The king's duplicity was not entirely secret. Many revolutionaries suspected his true feelings, but the constitutional system required his cooperation, creating an increasingly unstable situation. The flight to Varennes in June 1791 shattered any remaining illusions about the king's commitment to the revolution. Louis XVI and his family attempted to escape from Paris and reach the Austrian Netherlands, where they could join the émigré nobles and seek foreign assistance in restoring royal authority. The escape plan was elaborate but poorly executed, involving disguises, forged passports, and a specially constructed carriage that was both conspicuous and slow. The royal family was recognized and arrested in the small town of Varennes, just 30 miles from the border, and brought back to Paris under guard. The flight to Varennes created a constitutional crisis that exposed fundamental contradictions in the revolutionary settlement. The Constitution of 1791 was based on the premise that France would remain a monarchy. But how could the system function when the monarch had demonstrated his opposition to it by attempting to flee the country? The National Assembly chose to maintain the fiction that the king had been kidnapped, allowing him to retain his constitutional role while making it clear that he was essentially a prisoner. This compromise satisfied no one and created the conditions for further radicalization. The massacre of the Champ de Mars on July 17, 1791, marked the first major split within the revolutionary movement. A crowd of several thousand Republicans gathered on the Champ de Mars to sign a petition, demanding the king's abdication following his attempted flight. When the crowd refused to disperse, the National Guard, commanded by the Marquis de Lafayette, opened fire, killing approximately 50 people. The massacre demonstrated that the moderate revolutionaries who controlled the National Assembly were willing to use violence to maintain order and preserve the constitutional monarchy, even against their former allies. The Champ de Mars massacre had lasting consequences for the revolutionary movement, creating a permanent division between moderate constitutionalists and radical republicans. Many of the radical leaders, including Maximilien Robespierre and Georges Danton, were forced into hiding or temporary exile. The incident also established a pattern of using military force against popular demonstrations that would be repeated throughout the revolutionary period, though future governments would discover that violence was a double-edged sword that could easily turn against those who employed it. The completion of the Constitution of 1791 in September marked the end of the National Assembly's work and the beginning of a new phase of the revolution. Elections were held for the new Legislative Assembly, which convened in October 1791 with an entirely new membership, since the National Assembly had voted that none of its members could serve in the new legislature. This self-denying ordinance was intended to prevent the concentration of power, but it also meant that the new assembly lacked experienced legislators familiar with the complexities of revolutionary politics. The Legislative Assembly was dominated by the Girondins, a loose faction of deputies who generally supported the revolution, but favored a more aggressive foreign policy than their predecessors. The Girondins were convinced that foreign powers were plotting to restore the old regime in France, and they believed that a successful war would unite the French people behind the revolution while exposing domestic enemies. This analysis was not entirely wrong, but it underestimated the difficulties of conducting a war while simultaneously managing a domestic revolution. The declaration of war against Austria on April 20th, 1792, was supported by an unlikely coalition that included the Girondins, who wanted to spread revolutionary principles throughout Europe, and King Louis XVI, who hoped that military defeat would lead to the restoration of his authority. Only a small minority, led by Robespierre, opposed the war, arguing that France was not prepared for foreign conflict and that war would strengthen the executive power at the expense of democratic institutions. Robespierre's analysis proved remarkably prescient, though his warnings were ignored at the time. The early stages of the war went badly for France, as poorly equipped and demoralized armies suffered a series of defeats against Austrian and Prussian forces. The military failures intensified political tensions within France, as each faction blamed the others for the disasters. The Girondins accused the king of secretly supporting the enemy, while the king's supporters blamed the war on revolutionary incompetence. Popular suspicion of treason reached fever pitch, creating an atmosphere in which any setback could trigger violent retaliation against suspected enemies. The Brunswick Manifesto, issued by the Prussian commander in July 1792, inadvertently sealed the fate of the French monarchy. The manifesto threatened to destroy Paris if any harm came to the royal family, and declared the intention of the Allied powers to restore Louis XVI to full authority. The document was intended to intimidate the revolutionaries, but it had the opposite effect, convincing many French people that the king was indeed collaborating with foreign enemies. The manifesto transformed what had been suspicions about royal loyalty into apparent proof of treason. The insurrection of August 10, 1792, was more carefully planned and executed than previous popular uprisings, reflecting the growing political sophistication of the Parisian revolutionary movement. The insurrection was organized by the radical sections of Paris, neighborhood, political organizations that had become increasingly influential as the revolution progressed. On the night of August 9th to 10th, representatives from the sections established a revolutionary commune that claimed authority over Paris and began organizing an attack on the Tuileries Palace, where the royal family resided. The assault on the Tuileries on August 10th was a bloody affair that effectively ended the monarchy in France. The royal family had fled to the Legislative Assembly for protection, leaving the palace defended by Swiss guards and a few loyal courtiers. When the attacking crowd reached the palace, the Swiss guards initially held their fire, but confusion about orders led to a battle that resulted in the deaths of several hundred attackers and the massacre of most of the Swiss guards. The violence was more intense than in previous revolutionary journeys, reflecting the increasing polarization of French politics. The overthrow of the monarchy on August 10th created a power vacuum that was filled by the Paris Commune and the Legislative Assembly acting in uneasy cooperation. The Assembly voted to suspend the king from his functions and call for elections to a new national convention that would decide the fate of the monarchy and draft a new constitution. Universal male suffrage was established for these elections, dramatically expanding political participation beyond the property requirements of the 1791 Constitution. The decision to imprison the royal family in the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris, symbolized the complete break with the old regime. The September massacres of 1792 revealed the dark side of popular revolutionary enthusiasm and the dangers of political polarization in times of crisis. Between September 2nd and 6th, crowds in Paris attacked the city's prisons, killing over 1,000 prisoners, including many common criminals, as well as political prisoners. The massacres were triggered by fears that imprisoned counter-revolutionaries would escape and join the advancing enemy armies, but they quickly spiraled into indiscriminate violence that shocked even committed revolutionaries. The September massacres were organized by radical leaders who believed that extraordinary measures were necessary to defend the revolution. But they also reflected genuine popular fears about internal enemies and foreign invasion. The killings were not random mob violence, but rather a form of popular justice carried out by crowds who believed they were acting to save the revolution. However, the massacres also demonstrated how quickly revolutionary enthusiasm could turn into murderous fanaticism, foreshadowing the more systematic violence of the terror. The National Convention that convened on September 21, 1792, faced the enormous task of governing France during wartime, while creating new political institutions to replace the monarchy. The convention's first act was to abolish the monarchy and proclaim France a republic, a decision that was unanimous but had been predetermined by the events of August 10th. The convention also adopted a new calendar that dated the beginning of the republic from September 22, 1792, symbolically marking a complete break with the past and the beginning of a new era in human history. The trial of Louis XVI, which began in December 1792, forced the convention to confront fundamental questions about justice, popular sovereignty, and the nature of political authority. The king was charged with treason and conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, accusations that were supported by extensive documentary evidence discovered in the Tuileries Palace. However, the trial was as much a political as a legal proceeding, with different factions using the proceedings to advance their own agendas and discredit their opponents. The debate over the king's fate revealed the deep divisions within the convention between the Girondins, who favored exile or imprisonment, and the more radical Montagnards, who demanded execution. The Girondins argued that executing the king would unite all of Europe against France and make any future reconciliation impossible. The Montagnards, led by Robespierre, contended that the king's death was necessary to demonstrate the Republic's commitment to equality and justice. The debate was conducted with remarkable eloquence and philosophical sophistication, even as the outcome would determine whether a human being lived or died. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21, 1793, was a watershed moment that made any compromise with the old regime impossible and committed France irrevocably to the Republican path. The king faced death with considerable dignity, attempting to address the crowd from the scaffold before being silenced by the executioner. His last words, according to witnesses, were a declaration of forgiveness for those who condemned him, and a prayer that his blood would not bring misfortune to France. The execution was carried out efficiently by the guillotine, the revolutionary government's preferred method of execution, because it was considered more humane and egalitarian than traditional methods. The king's execution had immediate international consequences, as European monarchs recognized that the French Revolution now posed an existential threat to the principle of monarchy itself. Britain, Spain, and the Netherlands joined Austria and Prussia in the first coalition against France, creating a military situation that would dominate French politics for the next 2 decades. The war also provided justification for increasingly authoritarian measures within France, as the government argued that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary powers. The economic crisis that had triggered the revolution continued to plague the Republic, exacerbated by the costs of war and the disruption of normal commercial relationships. The assignats continued to depreciate, creating inflation that particularly hurt urban workers and people on fixed incomes. Food shortages became chronic in Paris and other cities, leading to demands for government intervention in the economy. The sans-culottes, the radical working-class activists who had become increasingly influential in Parisian politics, demanded price controls, requisitions of grain, and other measures that violated the free market principles favored by most convention deputies. The revolt in the Vendée, which began in March 1793, represented the most serious internal threat faced by the Republic and demonstrated the limits of revolutionary support in rural France. The uprising began as resistance to military conscription, but quickly developed into a full-scale, counter-revolutionary war that combined religious opposition to the civil constitution of the clergy with social and economic grievances against the revolutionary government. The Vendean rebels, supported by non-juring priests and émigré nobles, established an alternative government and army that controlled large areas of western France. The war in the Vendée was characterized by exceptional brutality on both sides, as the conflict took on the character of a religious and ideological crusade. The Republican armies, commanded by generals who viewed the rebellion as treason, employed increasingly harsh methods to suppress the uprising, including the systematic destruction of villages and the execution of prisoners. The rebels responded with equal violence, massacring Republican officials and supporters. The conflict would continue intermittently for several years, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives and leaving deep scars in French society. The crisis of spring 1793, military defeats abroad, economic collapse at home, and civil war in the provinces created the conditions for the rise of the Jacobins and the beginning of the Terror. The Jacobin Club, originally a moderate political organization, had been radicalized by the pressures of war and revolution, becoming the center of opposition to the Girondins. The Jacobins argued that the Republic could only survive through the implementation of emergency measures that would mobilize the entire nation for war while eliminating internal enemies. The expulsion of the Girondins from the convention on June 2, 1793, was accomplished through another carefully orchestrated popular insurrection that demonstrated the continuing power of the Parisian sections. The Girondins had become increasingly unpopular in Paris due to their opposition to price controls and their perceived moderation in the face of national crisis. When the sections surrounded the convention with armed crowds and cannons, the deputies had little choice but to vote for the arrest of the leading Girondin deputies. The purge eliminated the last significant opposition to radical measures within the convention. The Constitution of 1793, drafted by the Montagnard-dominated convention, was the most democratic constitution in European history up to that time, establishing universal male suffrage, the right to work, and extensive civil liberties. However, the Constitution was never implemented, as the convention voted to suspend it until the end of the war. This decision reflected the Jacobin belief that democratic government was impossible during a national emergency, but it also established a precedent for the indefinite postponement of constitutional government that would plague French politics for decades. The Committee of Public Safety, established in April 1793 and reorganized in July with Robespierre as its most influential member, became the effective government of France during the Terror. The committee was theoretically responsible to the convention, but in practice, it exercised dictatorial powers, coordinating military operations, economic policy, and the suppression of internal enemies. The committee's authority was based on the argument that extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures, but the concentration of power in a small group of men represented a fundamental departure from the democratic principles of the Revolution. Maximilien Robespierre emerged as the dominant figure in the Committee of Public Safety and the most influential leader of the Terror. Robespierre was a lawyer from Arras who had been active in revolutionary politics since 1789, earning the nickname the Incorruptible for his moral rigidity and dedication to revolutionary principles. His political philosophy combined Enlightenment rationalism with a quasi-religious devotion to virtue and the general will, leading him to believe that the Republic could only survive through the moral regeneration of the French people. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, provided the legal framework for the Terror by defining counter-revolutionary activity so broadly that almost anyone could be arrested on suspicion of opposing the Republic. The law authorized the arrest of anyone who had shown themselves to be enemies of liberty through their conduct, relationships, or spoken or written words. This vague language gave local authorities enormous discretion in determining who constituted a threat to the Republic, leading to thousands of arrests throughout France. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established to try political prisoners, became the primary instrument of revolutionary justice during the Terror. The tribunal was designed to provide swift justice, rather than careful legal proceedings, with simplified procedures that eliminated many traditional legal protections. Defendants were not allowed lawyers, witnesses were rarely called, and the presumption of innocence was effectively reversed. The tribunal's proceedings were public, serving as both entertainment and political education for Parisian crowds who packed the courtroom galleries. The execution of Marie Antoinette on October 16, 1793, demonstrated that the Terror would spare no one, regardless of their former status or gender. The former queen had been imprisoned since August 1792 and was widely hated as a symbol of aristocratic excess and foreign influence. Her trial was largely a formality, as the outcome had been predetermined by political necessity. Marie Antoinette faced death with considerable courage, maintaining her dignity despite the hostile crowds and humiliating circumstances of her final months. The Dechristianization campaign that reached its peak in late 1793 represented an attempt to eliminate Christianity from French society and replace it with a rational republican religion. Churches were closed or converted to temples of reason. Priests were forced to marry or renounce their vows, and Christian symbols were destroyed throughout France. The campaign was driven by the belief that Christianity was incompatible with republican virtue and that the Catholic Church remained a center of counter-revolutionary activity. The cult of reason, promoted by radical Dechristianizers like Jacques Hebert, attempted to create a new religion based on Enlightenment principles and revolutionary values. Festivals of reason were held in former churches, featuring allegorical performances and speeches celebrating human rationality and republican virtue. However, the cult never gained widespread popular support, as most French people remained attached to traditional religious practices despite their political support for the revolution. Robespierre's opposition to the Dechristianization campaign reflected his belief that the revolution needed some form of religious foundation to maintain popular support and moral authority. In May 1794, he organized the Festival of the Supreme Being, a deistic ceremony that acknowledged the existence of God while rejecting organized religion. The festival was elaborately staged, with Robespierre playing a prominent role as the high priest of the new civic religion. However, the ceremony struck many observers as pretentious and contributed to growing opposition to Robespierre's leadership. The economic policies of the Terror, known collectively as the war economy, represented an unprecedented attempt by a European government to control and direct economic activity. The maximum, a system of price controls on essential goods, was designed to ensure that urban workers could afford basic necessities while preventing speculation and hoarding. The policy was supplemented by requisitions of grain and other supplies for the army, creating a command economy that prioritized military needs over market mechanisms. The levy en masse, decreed in August 1793, mobilized the entire French nation for war in a manner unprecedented in European history. The decree declared that all citizens were permanently requisitioned for military service, with young men serving as soldiers, married men manufacturing weapons and transporting supplies, women making tents and clothing, children preparing bandages, and elderly men providing moral support through public speeches. This total mobilization transformed the character of warfare and demonstrated the revolutionary government's ability to harness popular enthusiasm for national defense. The military success of the revolutionary armies in 1793 and 1794 vindicated the Jacobin strategy of total war and popular mobilization. French forces, now numbering over 1 million men, began to push back the coalition armies and even to carry the war beyond France's borders. The victories were achieved through a combination of superior numbers, revolutionary enthusiasm, and innovative tactics that emphasized speed and aggression over the formal maneuvers preferred by 18th century armies. The success of the citizen soldiers also demonstrated that military effectiveness did not require aristocratic officers or professional training. The terror reached its peak in the spring of 1794 with the elimination of the various factions that had challenged Robespierre's leadership. The Hebertists, radical Dechristianizers, who had pushed for even more extreme measures, were arrested and executed in March 1794 on charges of conspiracy and corruption. 3 weeks later, the Dantonists, moderate Jacobin who had called for an end to the terror, met the same fate. Georges Danton, the great orator of the Revolution, was executed along with his followers, eliminating the last significant opposition to Robespierre within the revolutionary government. The execution of Danton marked a turning point in the terror, as many revolutionaries began to fear that no one was safe from Robespierre's increasingly rigid conception of virtue. Danton had been one of the most popular leaders of the revolution, and his death demonstrated that past services to the Republic provided no protection against charges of counter-revolutionary activity. The elimination of both the extreme left and the moderate opposition left Robespierre in an increasingly isolated position, dependent on a narrow circle of supporters who shared his vision of Republican virtue. The Great Terror of summer 1794 saw an acceleration in the pace of executions as the revolutionary tribunal processed cases with increasing speed and decreasing attention to evidence. The Law of 22 Prairial, passed in June 1794, further simplified legal procedures and expanded the definition of counter-revolutionary crimes to include slandering patriotism and seeking to inspire discouragement. The law effectively eliminated the presumption of innocence and made death the only penalty for political crimes, creating a system in which accusation was tantamount to conviction. The economic and social policies of the terror created significant improvements in the lives of ordinary French people, even as the political repression intensified. Price controls kept bread affordable in Paris and other cities, while the government's employment programs reduced unemployment. The abolition of slavery in the French colonies, decreed in February 1794, extended revolutionary principles of equality to the overseas territories. Educational reforms promoted literacy and civic education, while the metric system standardized weights and measures throughout France. The revolutionary calendar, adopted in October 1793, represented an attempt to break completely with the Christian past and create a new temporal framework for the Republic. The calendar divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each, with names derived from natural phenomena rather than Roman gods or Christian saints. Each month was divided into 3 10-day weeks called decades, with the 10th day replacing Sunday as the day of rest. The calendar was intended to promote rational thinking and republican values while eliminating religious influences from daily life. The cultural policies of the terror promoted a new aesthetic that emphasized simplicity, virtue, and patriotic themes. Artists and writers were encouraged to create works that would educate the people and promote republican values, leading to the production of numerous paintings, plays, and songs celebrating revolutionary heroes and principles. The government also organized elaborate festivals and ceremonies designed to create a sense of national unity and revolutionary enthusiasm. These cultural initiatives had lasting influence on French artistic traditions and contributed to the development of modern nationalism. The opposition to Robespierre that culminated in his overthrow on 9 Thermidor, July 27, 1794, was motivated by a combination of personal fear, political disagreement, and exhaustion with the terror's excesses. Many convention deputies had come to believe that Robespierre intended to establish a personal dictatorship and that they might be his next victims. The conspiracy against Robespierre was organized by former allies who had become convinced that his continued leadership threatened both their own survival and the stability of the Republic. The events of 9 Thermidor unfolded with dramatic speed as the carefully planned conspiracy against Robespierre succeeded beyond its organizers' expectations. When Robespierre attempted to address the convention, he was shouted down by deputies who had previously remained silent out of fear. The convention voted to arrest Robespierre and his closest supporters, effectively ending the terror in a single day. The ease with which Robespierre was overthrown demonstrated that his power had been more apparent than real, dependent on the acquiescence of colleagues who had lost faith in his leadership. Robespierre's execution on 10 Thermidor, along with 21 of his supporters, marked the end of the most radical phase of the French Revolution. The man who had sent thousands to the guillotine met his own death with less composure than many of his victims, his jaw shattered by a pistol shot during his arrest. The crowds that had once cheered his speeches now celebrated his death, demonstrating the fickleness of popular opinion and the isolation that had characterized his final months in power. The Thermidorian reaction that followed Robespierre's fall represented a conscious attempt to moderate the revolution while preserving its essential achievements. The new leadership, dominated by former Jacobins who had participated in the conspiracy against Robespierre, dismantled the apparatus of the terror while maintaining the Republic and the war effort. The Revolutionary Tribunal was reformed to provide greater legal protections. Political prisoners were released, and the economic controls of the terror were gradually abandoned. The White Terror that erupted in southern and eastern France during 1794 and 1795 demonstrated that the end of the Jacobin terror did not bring an end to political violence. Royalist groups, emboldened by the fall of Robespierre, launched attacks against former Jacobins and supporters of the terror. The violence was particularly intense in Lyon, Marseille, and other cities that had experienced severe repression during the radical phase of the revolution. The White Terror revealed the deep divisions that the revolution had created in French society and the difficulty of achieving national reconciliation. The economic crisis that followed the end of the terror was exacerbated by the abandonment of price controls and the continued depreciation of the assignats. The removal of the maximum led to rapid inflation as prices rose to market levels, causing severe hardship for urban workers who had benefited from the controlled economy. The government's financial situation deteriorated as military expenses continued to mount while tax collection remained inadequate. The economic difficulties contributed to social unrest and political instability that would plague the Directory period. The Constitution of 1795, adopted by the Thermidorian Convention, represented an attempt to create a stable republican government that would avoid both the chaos of direct democracy and the dangers of dictatorship. The Constitution established a bicameral legislature and a 5-member executive directory with complex electoral procedures designed to ensure that only property-owning citizens could participate in politics. The system was intended to create a moderate republic dominated by the educated middle class, but it proved unable to generate the legitimacy necessary for stable government. The Directory period, which lasted from 1795 to 1799, was characterized by political instability, economic crisis, and military expansion that gradually transformed the character of the French Revolution. The new government faced constant challenges from both royalist conspirators and neo-Jacobin republicans, leading to a series of coups and purges that undermined constitutional government. The Directory's inability to solve France's economic problems or achieve political stability created the conditions for the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The conspiracy of Gracchus Babeuf in 1796 represented the first modern communist movement and demonstrated that the revolution had created new forms of radical politics that went beyond the bourgeois republicanism of the Directory. Babeuf and his followers, known as the Equals, advocated the complete abolition of private property and the establishment of a communist society based on common ownership and equal distribution of goods. The conspiracy was discovered and suppressed before it could be implemented, but it influenced later socialist and communist movements. The military campaigns of the Directory period transformed France from a besieged republic into an aggressive imperial power that dominated much of Europe. The success of French armies in Italy Germany, and other theaters was due partly to superior organization and tactics, but also to the revolutionary government's ability to mobilize resources and manpower on an unprecedented scale. The military victories provided the Directory with prestige and financial resources through the systematic plunder of conquered territories. Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to prominence during the Directory period was facilitated by his military genius and his ability to present himself as the defender of revolutionary principles against both foreign enemies and domestic reaction. His victories in Italy made him a national hero, while his political skills enabled him to build alliances with various factions within the Directory. Napoleon's coup of 18 Brumaire, November 9, 1799, was initially welcomed by many French people who hoped that strong leadership would bring stability and prosperity after a decade of revolutionary turmoil. The establishment of the consulate under Napoleon's leadership marked the effective end of the French Revolution, though many of its achievements were preserved and even extended under the new regime. The consulate maintained the principle of legal equality, religious toleration, and careers open to talent while establishing a more efficient and centralized government. The Civil Code, promulgated in 1804, codified many revolutionary principles and became a model for legal systems throughout Europe and beyond. The long-term consequences of the French Revolution extended far beyond France itself, influencing political development throughout Europe and the Americas for generations. The revolution established the principle of popular sovereignty, demonstrated the possibility of overthrowing established governments, and created new forms of nationalism that would reshape the European political landscape. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars spread French ideas and institutions throughout Europe, contributing to the eventual collapse of the old regime across the continent. The revolution's impact on social and economic development was equally profound, accelerating the transition from feudalism to capitalism and creating new forms of class conflict that would dominate 19th century politics. The abolition of feudalism, the sale of church lands, and the establishment of legal equality created conditions for rapid economic development, while generating new forms of social tension. The revolution also promoted the development of modern bureaucracy, public education, and other institutions that became characteristic of the modern state. The French Revolution's influence on political thought and practice was perhaps its most enduring legacy, establishing concepts of human rights, constitutional government, and democratic participation that continue to shape political discourse today. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen became a foundational document for liberal democracy, while the revolution's more radical phases inspired socialist and communist movements. The revolution demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of popular political participation, providing lessons that continue to influence democratic theory and practice. The revolution's complex relationship with violence and terror raised fundamental questions about the means and ends of political change that remain relevant today. The Jacobin argument that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary measures became a template for later revolutionary movements, while the excesses of the terror provided a warning about the dangers of ideological extremism. The revolution's legacy thus includes both inspiring examples of human liberation and sobering reminders of the potential for political violence. The transformation of France from an absolute monarchy to a modern nation-state during the Revolutionary decade created institutional and cultural changes that proved irreversible despite subsequent political upheavals. The centralized administrative system, the uniform legal code, the metric system, and the secular educational system all survived the restoration of the monarchy and became permanent features of French society. The Revolution thus achieved a fundamental modernization of French institutions that provided the foundation for the country's subsequent development as a major European power. The cultural revolution that accompanied the political transformation of France involved a systematic attempt to reshape French society according to rational and egalitarian principles. The revolutionaries believed that changing laws and institutions was insufficient if the people retained the habits and attitudes of the old regime. This ambitious project of social engineering included efforts to reform language, eliminate regional dialects in favor of standard French, and create new forms of civic ritual that would bind citizens together in a shared national identity. The process was often heavy-handed and met with considerable resistance, particularly in rural areas where traditional customs remained deeply entrenched. The revolutionary government's approach to education reflected its belief that creating good citizens required systematic instruction in republican virtues and rational thinking. The convention established a comprehensive plan for public education that would provide free, secular instruction to all French children, regardless of social background. The curriculum emphasized practical subjects like mathematics and science, while promoting civic education designed to instill patriotic values. However, the implementation of these educational reforms was hampered by financial constraints, the shortage of qualified teachers, and resistance from parents who preferred traditional religious instruction. The revolution's impact on women's lives was complex and contradictory, simultaneously expanding some opportunities while reinforcing traditional gender roles in other areas. Women played crucial roles in revolutionary events, from the October days of 1789 to the bread riots that punctuated the entire period. Female political clubs emerged in Paris and other cities, with women demanding greater political participation and legal equality. However, the convention ultimately rejected women's claims to full citizenship, maintaining that their primary role was as mothers and wives who would raise virtuous republican children rather than as active participants in political life. Olympe de Gouges, the playwright and political activist who authored the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen in 1791, exemplified both the possibilities and limitations of women's participation in revolutionary politics. Her declaration challenged the exclusion of women from the rights of man, arguing that if women were subject to the law and could be executed for political crimes, they should also enjoy full political rights. De Gouges paid for her political activism with her life, executed during the Terror in 1793, but her writings influenced later feminist movements and highlighted the contradictions in revolutionary ideology. The revolution's treatment of religious minorities revealed both its progressive potential and its limitations in extending tolerance and equality. The Jewish population of France, concentrated primarily in Alsace and the Papal territories of southern France, gained full citizenship rights in 1791 after considerable debate about whether religious differences were compatible with national unity. This represented a dramatic improvement in Jewish legal status, though social prejudice and economic discrimination persisted. Protestant minorities, who had suffered under the old regime's Catholic monopoly, generally welcomed the revolution's religious policies and became strong supporters of the new order. The colonial dimensions of the French Revolution created some of its most dramatic and contradictory episodes, as the principles of liberty and equality collided with the economic interests of the slave-based plantation system. The revolution's impact on the Korean colonies was immediate and profound, as free people of color demanded political rights while enslaved populations seized on revolutionary rhetoric to justify their own claims to freedom. The resulting conflicts were complicated by international warfare, as Britain and Spain sought to exploit French colonial difficulties for their own advantage. The Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture and other former slaves, represented the most radical application of revolutionary principles and demonstrated the universal implications of the Declaration of Rights. The success of the slave rebellion in Saint-Domingue forced the French government to confront the contradiction between revolutionary ideals and colonial slavery, ultimately leading to the abolition of slavery throughout the French Empire in 1794. However, this decision was reversed under Napoleon, revealing the limits of revolutionary commitment to racial equality and human rights. The economic transformation of France during the revolutionary period involved more than just the immediate crisis management measures like price controls and paper money. The revolution fundamentally altered property relationships throughout French society, not only through the sale of church lands, but also through the abolition of feudal obligations and the establishment of free trade within France. The elimination of internal customs barriers and guild restrictions created a unified national market for the first time, while the standardization of weights, measures, and currency facilitated commercial development. The revolutionary government's attempts to manage the economy revealed the tension between ideological commitments to free markets and practical necessities of wartime governance. The sans-culottes consistently demanded government intervention to ensure adequate food supplies and fair prices, while bourgeois revolutionaries preferred market mechanisms and worried about the economic consequences of extensive regulation. This conflict between popular demands and economic theory would recur throughout the revolutionary period and influence later debates about the proper role of government in economic affairs. The development of revolutionary political culture involved the creation of new symbols, rituals, and forms of public participation that would influence democratic movements for generations. The tricolor flag, the Marseillaise, and the imagery of Marianne as the personification of the Republic became enduring symbols of French national identity. Revolutionary festivals and ceremonies provided opportunities for mass participation in political life, while political clubs and popular societies created new forms of civic engagement that extended far beyond traditional elite politics. The revolutionary press played a crucial role in shaping public opinion and mobilizing popular support for various political positions. Newspapers like Marat's L'Ami du Peuple and Hebert's Père Duchesne used inflammatory rhetoric and popular language to reach audiences that had previously been excluded from political discourse. The proliferation of pamphlets, broadsides, and other printed materials created an unprecedented public debate about political questions. Though the government's attempts to control the press during the Terror demonstrated the limits of revolutionary commitment to free expression, the international impact of the French Revolution extended far beyond the immediate military conflicts, influencing political movements and intellectual development throughout Europe and the Americas. The revolution's example inspired democratic movements in countries as diverse as Poland, Ireland, and the German states, while its principles influenced the development of nationalism and liberalism throughout the 19th century. The Revolutionary Wars also accelerated the spread of French ideas and institutions, as conquered territories were reorganized according to revolutionary principles. The counter-revolutionary movement that emerged in response to the revolution was equally international in scope, involving émigré nobles, foreign governments, and domestic opponents who sought to restore the old regime through various means. The counter-revolution was never simply a reactionary movement seeking to turn back the clock, but rather a complex phenomenon that included both traditionalist elements and more sophisticated attempts to create alternative forms of modern government that would preserve social hierarchy while adapting to changed circumstances. The role of violence in the French Revolution remains one of its most controversial and significant aspects, raising fundamental questions about the relationship between political change and physical force. The revolution began with relatively limited violence, but the pressures of war, economic crisis, and political polarization led to increasingly systematic use of terror as an instrument of government policy. The guillotine became the symbol of revolutionary justice, employed not only against political enemies, but also as a demonstration of the Republic's commitment to equality before the law. The psychology of revolutionary violence involved complex interactions between ideological conviction, practical necessity, and crowd dynamics that historians continue to debate. The revolutionaries genuinely believed that they were defending liberty and equality against enemies who would destroy the Republic if given the opportunity. However, the definition of who constituted an enemy expanded steadily during the Terror, ultimately encompassing anyone who failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for revolutionary principles. This expansion of the category of enemies reflected both paranoia and the logic of revolutionary ideology, which demanded complete commitment to the cause. The provincial experience of the revolution varied considerably depending on local conditions, social structures, and political traditions. Regions with strong Catholic traditions and limited commercial development, such as the Vendée and parts of Brittany, remained largely hostile to revolutionary changes and provided the social base for counter-revolutionary movements. Urban areas and regions with more developed commercial agriculture generally supported the revolution, though they often disagreed about specific policies and the pace of change. The revolution's impact on daily life extended into the most intimate aspects of human experience, from the foods people ate to the clothes they wore, to the names they gave their children. Revolutionary authorities promoted simple, republican fashions that rejected the elaborate styles associated with aristocratic culture, while the economic disruptions of the period forced most people to adapt to shortages and substitutions. The revolutionary calendar affected work patterns and social rhythms, while the campaign against Christianity disrupted traditional life cycle ceremonies and community celebrations. The linguistic policies of the revolution reflected its commitment to creating a unified national culture based on reason and equality. The government promoted the use of standard French throughout the country, viewing regional languages and dialects as obstacles to national unity and democratic participation. This policy had lasting consequences for French cultural development, contributing to the gradual decline of regional languages, while strengthening the dominance of Parisian French as the language of education, government, and cultural expression. The revolution's approach to science and technology demonstrated its faith in human reason and progress, leading to significant advances in various fields despite the political turmoil. The metric system, developed by revolutionary scientists, represented an attempt to create rational, universal standards based on natural phenomena rather than arbitrary traditional measures. The government also supported scientific research and education, establishing new institutions like the École Polytechnique that would train the technical experts needed for national development. The medical and public health policies of the revolutionary government reflected both humanitarian concerns and practical necessities of wartime mobilization. The revolution established the principle that society had an obligation to care for the sick and disabled, leading to reforms in hospital administration and medical education. However, the disruption of traditional charitable institutions and the pressures of war often made it difficult to implement these idealistic policies effectively. The revolution's treatment of the arts revealed the tension between its commitment to popular education and its suspicion of elite culture. Revolutionary authorities promoted art that would serve educational and political purposes, commissioning works that celebrated Republican virtues and historical events. However, many artists struggled to adapt to the new political requirements, while the economic disruptions of the period made it difficult to maintain traditional forms of artistic patronage. The transformation of Paris during the revolutionary period involved both physical changes to the urban landscape and fundamental alterations in the city's social and political character. Revolutionary crowds demolished symbols of the old regime, from the Bastille to aristocratic mansions, while new monuments and street names celebrated Republican heroes and principles. The city's role as the center of revolutionary politics attracted migrants from throughout France, creating a more diverse and politically engaged urban population. The revolution's impact on family life and gender relations was profound but often contradictory, simultaneously promoting individual rights while reinforcing certain traditional structures. The legalization of divorce and the establishment of civil marriage represented significant advances in personal freedom, particularly for women who had been trapped in unhappy marriages. However, the revolution also emphasized the importance of the family as the foundation of Republican society leading to policies that reinforced women's domestic roles while expanding their legal rights in some areas. The educational philosophy of the Revolution emphasized the importance of creating informed citizens capable of participating in democratic government. This required not only basic literacy and numeracy, but also instruction in civic virtues and rational thinking. The revolutionaries believed that education could overcome the prejudices and superstitions of the old regime, creating a new generation of French people committed to liberty, equality, and fraternity. However, the practical implementation of these educational ideals proved extremely difficult given the limited resources and political instability of the period. The revolution's approach to criminal justice reflected its commitment to equality before the law and its rejection of the arbitrary punishments characteristic of the old regime. The new legal system eliminated torture, established uniform penalties for similar crimes, and guaranteed basic procedural rights for defendants. However, the pressures of political crisis led to the creation of exceptional tribunals and procedures that violated these principles, demonstrating the difficulty of maintaining legal protections during periods of intense political conflict. The economic legacy of the French Revolution was complex and long-lasting, involving both immediate disruptions and fundamental structural changes that would influence French development for generations. The revolution eliminated many traditional barriers to economic development, from feudal obligations to guild restrictions, while creating new forms of property ownership and commercial organization. However, the immediate costs of revolution and war were enormous, leading to inflation, debt, and economic instability that persisted well into the 19th century. The revolution's influence on European political development extended far beyond France itself, inspiring democratic movements while also provoking conservative reactions that would shape 19th century politics. The revolutionary example demonstrated that established governments could be overthrown and replaced with new forms of political organization based on popular sovereignty and individual rights. However, the violence and instability of the revolutionary period also provided ammunition for critics of democracy and popular government. The religious consequences of the French Revolution were particularly profound and enduring, fundamentally altering the relationship between church and state throughout Europe. The revolution's attack on the Catholic Church's privileged position and its attempt to create a national church subordinate to civil authority challenged the traditional alliance between throne and altar that had characterized European politics for centuries. These changes influenced religious and political development throughout the 19th century and beyond. The revolution's impact on concepts of citizenship and national identity created new forms of political loyalty that transcended traditional attachments to locality, family, or social group. The idea that all citizens were equal members of the nation, regardless of birth or social position, represented a fundamental challenge to hierarchical society and provided the foundation for modern democratic politics. However, the revolution also demonstrated the potential for nationalism to become exclusive and aggressive, foreshadowing later conflicts over national boundaries and ethnic identity. The French Revolution's place in world history as the first successful attempt to create a modern democratic society based on popular sovereignty and individual rights cannot be overstated. Despite its failures and contradictions, the revolution established principles and precedents that would influence political development throughout the modern world. The revolutionary slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity became a rallying cry for democratic movements everywhere, while the revolution's example demonstrated both the possibilities and the dangers of popular political participation. The gradual consolidation of Napoleon's power after 1799 represented both a continuation and a betrayal of revolutionary principles, preserving many of the revolution's achievements while establishing a new form of authoritarian government. Napoleon's legal, administrative, and educational reforms codified and extended many revolutionary changes, creating institutions that would survive his eventual defeat and influence European development for generations. However, his establishment of a new nobility and his aggressive imperial policies represented a clear departure from the democratic and peaceful ideals that had initially inspired the revolutionary movement.